So remember, you've got to choose one of hazards, ecosystems, or resource reliance. This is the resource reliance example. So what do we need to know for resource reliance? So we've got a certain amount of vocabulary that we need to know. So we need to know what we mean by a resource. So a resource is a physical material that is useful to people, that is valuable to people. What do we mean by a finite resource? We mean a resource that once we've used it up, we will have run out of it. For example, oil. What do we mean by mechanisation? This is where machinery starts to do the jobs that used to be done by people, making it more efficient. Commercial farming, that means farming to make a profit. Commercial fishing, fishing to make a big profit. What do we mean by food security? Food security is where you have access to affordable, safe, and nutritious food today and tomorrow. What do we mean by the Malthus and Boserup theories? So the Malthus theory says population increases exponentially, 2, 4, 8, 16, whereas resources increase arithmetically, 1, 2, 3, 4. Therefore, we get to the point where we have a point of crisis. There is not enough food or resources for the amount of people on the earth. At that point, we go into a negative spiral of decline. Boserup, on the other hand, says that the increase in population is a good thing. Necessity is the mother of all invention. If we have more people, we have more new technologies being invented. We will never reach a point of crisis because we will always invent new technologies to enable us to grow more food. Throughout history, we've got examples such as fertilizers, irrigation systems, sprinkler systems, genetically modified crops going forward. We will never reach that point of crisis that Malthus talks about. Ethical consumerism is where we buy products that have a positive social, economic, or environmental impact. An example of that would be buying fair trade products, which ensure that the farmers in the poor countries get a fair price for their work. There's a minimum wage, so their wages never drop too low. How do we use technology to improve food security? We can talk about genetically modified crops, where you take the DNA from one species, like the Arctic flounder fish, and insert it into another species, like a strawberry. Then you've got strawberries that will grow in cold conditions, and you can grow more strawberries into the autumn in Britain. Why has demand for resources increased? Because the population has increased exponentially and countries are developing. And as countries get richer, they use more and more resources. As countries get richer, people move from not owning anything to get around, just getting around walking, to then owning a bicycle to get around. Then they might own a small motorbike to get around. Then eventually they're rich enough to own a car. Then they're rich enough to own a larger car. And so as countries get richer, they use more resources. What do we mean by finite and threatened supply? So finite means they will run out. Oil and gas will run out. Threatened is to do with climate change. As the climate changes, it's harder to grow food in some places. How are environments and ecosystems modified by humans? So we mechanise our farming. We change the rivers, we put dams in, we change our natural ecosystems and turn them into big farms. Commercial fishing. We overfish. We want certain fish. For example, the bluefin tuna. And we've fished that to near extinction by taking so many of them out of the ocean. Then you've got problems like, for example, bycatch. Remember, they're only allowed to catch a certain amount of different species of fish. if they catch more than they're allowed to take to shore, they end up just throwing it back into the ocean dead or dying so that they don't get a fine. Then you've got things like bottom trawling, where they drag their nets along the bottom of the ocean to fish, and that destroys everything that they drag the net across. Poor old Nemo and all his friends are destroyed their habitat with that bottom trawling. How is deforestation used to obtain energy? So we are using the trees in LIDCs. We're gathering wood for cooking and heating. Or we are chopping down the trees so that we can mine to get the oil beneath the ground. Or we are chopping down the trees so that we can grow biofuels, so we can grow the crops that are turned into our biofuel energies. What different types of pollution are we creating through this obtaining energy? So soil pollution, river pollution, where the toxic chemicals get washed into the rivers, ocean pollution, where we try and ship oil around the world in big tankers and then we get oil spills, air pollution from the dust from mining. How do systems to secure water supplies alter environments and ecosystems? So we build big dams and reservoirs. People are forced to move out of their homes so that we can make space for these. The fish are no longer able to swim upstream through past the dam. They then face extinction. The classic example of that was the Chinese river dolphin. The dam traps sediment. And then you've also got water transfer schemes where you build massive pipelines to take the water from where you've got too much to where you've not got enough. And that creates a huge amount of change to the ecosystems. You might be taking species, alien species, from one part of the country to another, interfering with the ecosystems. You might end up taking too much from the source place and they end up getting too dry and suffering from water stress. What physical and human factors influence food security? So physical factors include the temperature. Places that are too hot or too cold can't grow good crops, can't grow good food. If the soil is really poor quality, you can't grow good crops. If you don't have enough water, you can't grow good crops. If you have plagues of locusts and insects coming in, that affects your crops. Human factors include poverty. If you can't afford to buy food or you can't afford to buy seeds to grow food, you face food insecurity. If you've got poor infrastructure, you can't get your crops to market. If you've got conflict, if you've got war and fighting, you can't farm the land. It's not safe to do so, and people are moving constantly from place to place, never stopping long enough to be able to grow any food. How do we illustrate patterns of access to food? So we can talk about the Global Hunger Index, which is scored from 0 to 100, where 0 is zero hunger. And that looks at undernourishment, child wasting, and child stunting, and child mortality. Or you've got the Global Food Security Index that looks at 28 indicators, including the availability of food, the affordability of food. How is food wasted? It's wasted at every stage of the food chain. Sometimes the crops are damaged, sometimes the packaging is poor, sometimes the storage is not very good. Or remember, you've got supermarkets with very strict rules of what a carrot must look like and how straight it is and how large it can be. A banana has to be a certain curvature. These fruits and vegetables that don't fit these strict rules are thrown away. Huge amount of waste. Then you've got the environmental, social and economic sustainability of attempts to achieve food security. So we're trying to grow more food through intensive farming. We're using fertilizers. Fertilizers get washed into the rivers, causing eutrophication. The fertilizers make the algae in the river grow big and strong, which then blocks out the sunlight, which then means the fish are not able to get oxygen and the fish in the rivers die. Where factory farming, we try and keep as many chickens as we possibly can in tiny cages. They don't even get to turn around. It's much cheaper, but it's cruel, and it creates a huge amount of chicken waste that we have to get rid of. How can we make ethical choices to reduce food waste? Buying things that are locally grown so that we don't waste loads of products during transportation. Eating ugly. Supermarkets have started selling ugly fruit and veg so that it's not thrown away, it's not wasted, and we don't need to grow as much. Commercial versus organic farming. Commercial farming, you will be able to grow a huge amount in terms of yield. You will be able to grow a huge amount of food to improve food security cheaply. But the chemicals that you use along the way will pollute the environment, will cause eutrophication. The fertilizers release greenhouse gases. Organic farming, you don't use chemicals. It's much better for the environment, much better in terms of biodiversity, and the animals are much happier. But you decrease your yields, and it's very expensive, and fewer people can therefore afford the fruit and vegetable. So there are pros and cons of both. What are the advantages and disadvantages of GM crops? So this is where we're using technology to improve food security. So the advantages are you can grow drought-resistant crops. So you can grow crops in places we can't currently grow them. You can add your own herbicides to the crop so you don't need to spray them. You can add nutrients like vitamin A to the crop so that people get more nutrients in their diet. However, it may not be safe. The pollen may spread and contaminate other plants. We're worried about super weeds developing that will be resistant to pesticides, and we're worried about the impact it will have on the environment and the biodiversity. An example of a small-scale approach to achieving food security. So here you can use goat aid in Babati. So we can talk about the goat aid, we can talk about where they were given their 2 Toggenburg goats, a male and female that bred, that made baby goats, and they were then able to sell the milk and the cheese that they'd made from those goats to be able to make money, to then send their kids to school, to get a better education, and to move out of poverty. However, the vet's bills were very expensive and they couldn't afford them. And the goats used a huge amount of water, which is scarce in that location. So here is our goat aid case study. And we also need to know our Tanzania-Canada wheat program. And remember, this is an example of a national scale scheme, past scheme to achieve food security. And then you've got your hub and outgrower model in Tanzania, which is a present day scheme to achieve food security. Goat aid is our local scale scheme to achieve food security. So our goat aid case study, which is an example of a local scale bottom up attempt to improve food security in Babati village in Tanzania. So the UK charity Farm Africa invested £250,000 in Toggenburg goats. The goats were given to the villagers, 1 male, 1 female, on credit to be paid back. And the villagers were trained on how to look after goats. The goats bred and had baby goats, which they could then sell. The milk from the goats could be turned into cheese and sold, and the money that they made, they're able to send their kids to school, to get a good education, to get a good job and move out of poverty. They could also spend their money on seeds and tools to improve their farming, to improve their income, and then spend that money improving their homes and improve their standard of living. However, looking after the goats uses a large amount of water, which is a scarce resource in this part of Tanzania, so it puts pressure on the supplies. When the goats get sick, the vet's bills can be very expensive. They can't afford to pay them, the goats die. Essentially, it's a very small village, so any improvement to food security is very small scale. Overall, goat aid has improved food security for the people of Babati, definitely to some extent. There are many positives. However, we can also see that there are some negatives, such as the high demand for water, and the cost of the vet's bills. The Tanzania-Canada Wheat Programme is the national scale past attempt to improve food security. So this was begun by the president of Tanzania, who was in the 60s asking Canada for help to grow wheat. Between 63 and 93, Canada provided $95 million in aid, and they turned 26,000 hectares of the Hanang district into wheat fields. Canada gave them experts, seeds, machinery, fertilizers for free at first, but eventually they charged them. They had a cost for everything. So the scheme had some success, provided 60% of Tanzania's wheat, trained 121 as wheat farmers, and had up to 400 people working on the farms. The infrastructure was improved greatly, making it much easier for them to get around and to trade. And it meant that when they faced drought in 92, Tanzania did not have to rely on charity, on food aid. However, ultimately, this scheme had many failings. The low yields of wheat actually meant it would have been cheaper to import wheat. And as they were only growing the one crop, biodiversity reduced. Most Tanzanians can't actually afford wheat bread. They prefer maize as their staple cereal. So the majority of the crop was actually grown for export, not for the local people. And perhaps more importantly, the Barabaig people were forced from their land, which actually made their food security worse. Canada eventually started charging for everything. Tanzanians weren't able to afford spare parts and fuel for their tractors, so they just lay rusting in the fields. And it's fair to say that Canada were the main benefactors of this scheme. Then you've got the local attempt, national scale, to achieve food security. And this is the hub and outgrower model. So you've got these large-scale commercial farms, big farms that act as hubs. They've got electricity supply, they've got storage facilities, seeds, fertilizers, a little reservoir for irrigation water, and excellent road access to the markets. Then you've got lots of smaller surrounding farms that are able to tap into the bigger hubs and take advantage of their facilities. And this has had great success. Those farms have been able to improve their rice yields up to 8 times. So they're growing 8 times more rice. They're then able to make much more money from that, which they can then invest in sending their kids to school, to get a good job, to move out of poverty, improving their homes, to improve their standard of living. However, the nomadic tribes have also lost access to their water sources for their animals here, and their food security has decreased. And essentially, when you look at it, it's the big commercial hub farms that have benefited the most. The smaller landowners are not involved in any of the decisions that are made. Okay, so there's a few questions. So looking at the pattern of countries where hunger is classified as serious. So we can use our continents. Malthus and Boserup and being able to compare the two. Talking about human factors, important in terms of food security. If it's saying something like this, human factors are most important in dictating the level of food security, you would argue that perhaps physical factors are also arguably maybe more important in your answer. Explain 2 factors that lead to demand outstripping supply of food. So you can talk about things like drought, like conflict, like COVID. Water transfer schemes and reservoirs, mechanisation and how that damages ecosystems, the term food security. Again, you've got another world map there, and you've got to describe the pattern. So we're talking about using Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, specific continent names. And then these are the what's not come up yet questions. So again, looking at demand outstripping supply for energy, and the fact that we've got a finite supply and an increasing demand in terms of population growth and increased development. Water supply, so we need to be able to talk about our dams and reservoirs and our water transfer schemes. How environments and ecosystems are used and modified to provide energy, so that is our collecting wood in LIDCs, chopping the trees down to mine for oil in EDCs, or chopping the trees down to grow biofuels. Biofuels, by the way, is where you grow crops which you turn into fuel, and they're said to be carbon neutral because when you grow the crops photosynthesize and take in carbon. When you then burn those crops, you create equal amounts of carbon as has been taken in as they grow. 2 physical factors that influence food security. One way world patterns can be illustrated. Evaluate the success of food production methods to sustainably achieve food security. So talking about organic farming versus intensive farming in that instance. Evaluate the success of small-scale bottom-up approaches. Well, this is where you talk about your goat aid. Okay, so that's a quick run through of your resource reliance option. Make sure you go back to the main video so that you can look at section C, the fieldwork questions.